We're going to get started right on time in just 1 minute. Assalamu alaikum and welcome. My name is Dalia Mogahed and I am the Director of Research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. Thank you so much for joining us and spending some of your afternoon discussing these important results. I'm going to be presenting the data this afternoon, and then I'll be introducing our panelists and having a discussion afterwards, and after that we'll do Q&A. If you'd like to share anything you think is interesting from this presentation, please do so, and don't forget to tag us. Our hashtag for this work is ISPU poll. Now, before getting started,
for more than 30 years,
we'd like to share a message from our generous sponsor for this webinar series, Amana Mutual Fund.
The Amana Mutual Funds have provided halal investment vehicles serving the unique needs of the Muslim community. Discover how you can align your investments with your principles in a retirement, health, or education savings account, or invest for Hajj. To obtain this and other important information in a prospectus or summary prospectus, please visit www.amanafunds.com or call toll-free 1-800-732-6262. Please read the prospectus and consider an investment's objectives, risks, charges, and expenses carefully before investing. Investing involves risk, including possible loss of principal. The Amana funds limit the securities they purchase to those consistent with Islamic principles. This limits opportunities and may affect performance.
All right, great. So let's go ahead and dive right in. What I'll cover today is first why this poll, and then I'll go into the methodology that we use to collect the data, focus on the key findings for one aspect of the data for this specific webinar, and then we'll do discussion and Q&A. So just jumping right in, why is this poll so important and why did we do this poll? Well, first of all, we are at the beginning of, or right before a critical election. And so we wanted to do this poll so that we could inform the dialogue and the debates taking place before an important election. And so we knew that this poll would be important because of its timing, because it comes right before this election. We also knew that it would be important because it's our 5th annual poll. And so we now have 5 years of trend data. And this is really valuable and very, very unique, where we know what has changed over the past 5 years of a Trump presidency for American Muslims. But we didn't realize just how historic this poll would be because we went into the field mid-March to mid-April of 2020, right at the beginning of a global pandemic and the lockdown that came with it. So we were able to take a snapshot of this historical moment. And it was only a few months before another historical event, this time protests calling for racial equity. And so this year, our poll is called Amidst Pandemic and Protest because it takes a snapshot of this moment in history. Our partner for the poll, as we've used for the past 5 years, is SSRS. They are one of the top polling firms in the United States. They've done polling for CNN, CBS, ABC, the Washington Post, and many other media outlets. Their sampling and weighting was led by Jonathan Best, who's the Vice President for Advanced Scientific Methods at SSRS. He's a longtime member and presenter at APOR, and also a member of the American Statistical Association. Now, our methodology, all participants in this survey received identical questions. We have a nationally representative sample of Muslims at a sample size of 800 people, Jewish Americans at almost 400, 382, Catholic, Protestant, white evangelical, and non-affiliated Americans. And these were all taken from the nationally representative sample size. Now, as I mentioned, the survey fielding dates were March 17th until April 22nd of this year. And you can read much more than I'll be presenting today at www.ispu.org/poll. Our work wouldn't be complete without our phenomenal advisors. So we have invited the top minds on surveys and polling of American Muslims to join our advisory council. And we're very proud of the work of our advisors to make our poll as robust and as thoughtful as possible. Now, jumping into the key findings, and what we're doing this year is breaking up our presentation of the data into 4 parts so that we're able to really unpack and discuss each section. So today we're launching all of the research online, so you can read about everything on our website, but today's presentation and discussion will focus on civic engagement and political engagement among American Muslims. So some of the key takeaways. First, Muslims remain more satisfied than the general public with the direction of the country. And that was also the case last year. Though higher than previous years, Muslim Americans' approval of President Trump remains lower than other groups. Muslims continue to make gains in voter registration, but remain lower than other groups. And Muslims exceed or are on par with the general public in political activity beyond voting. And we'll get into what that means as I go on. Now, some other topics covered by our poll, which we haven't yet released, but we'll do at a later time. We've looked at divorce in the Muslim community, mental health and suicidality was covered in our surveys. Issues around religious literacy, media consumption, faith and religiosity, experience and views on drug addiction, as well as disability. So focusing now specifically on civic and political engagement in the American Muslim community. Starting off, Muslims were more likely than the general public to be satisfied with the direction of the country. This was always a data point that is puzzling to many people, but 37% of Muslims say that overall, are you satisfied or dissatisfied with the way things are going in this country today? And the answer is yes, they are satisfied, 37%, versus only 27% of the general public. So slightly higher, but really on par with other faith communities, Jewish, Catholic, and Protestants, and just slightly lower than white evangelicals. Again, it's important to note that being satisfied with the way that things are going in this country isn't just defined by who the president is. There's a lot more to it than that. Muslim satisfaction has actually been steady over the past 2 years. So in 2016, this was right before Trump took office, that we, or I'm sorry, not right before he took office. That was 2017. That was right before he took office. But in 2016, President Obama was still the president. And so 63% of Muslims said that they were satisfied with the way things were going in the country. And it dipped steadily until 2018 at 27%, and then started to climb steadily back up, though not dramatically. So it's really been pretty steady over the past 3 years. Now, registration to vote, that has been something that that has grown, but Muslim voter registration still lags behind other groups. 78% of Muslims who are eligible to vote, remember this is among eligible voters, say that they are registered, compared to higher numbers in other faith communities. Now, that's the bad news, is that there's still a lag behind other faith communities. The good news is that unregistered Muslim voters have actually dropped by half. So whereas in 2016, a full 39% of eligible Muslim voters were not registered, and that number has been halved to only 21% who are not registered. The other thing that that has changed is the percentage that are what we call inshallah voters. Inshallah has now become a topic of national conversation after the debate. And we actually had this term as a part of our research. 2016, here, 60% of Muslims were registered to vote, whereas 81% said they planned to vote in the 2016 election. And so there's this gap of 21%, which we call the inshallah voter, which is someone, who wants to vote, plans to vote, intends to vote, but hasn't gotten around to actually registering to vote. Now that percentage is much, much smaller. Only 3% fall into this category of a gap between being registered and actually intending to vote and actually being registered. So aside from voting, we wanted to go beyond voting to look at some other measures of political engagement. And here, interestingly, though Muslims lag behind other communities in registration, they actually exceed or are on par with the general public and other faith communities when it comes to some other important measures of political engagement. So here we looked at Muslims are among the most likely to attend a town hall meeting. Now, as you can see, the numbers aren't high in any community, but among Muslims, 22%, more than 1 in 5, have attended a town hall meeting in the past 12 months, and that exceeds other faith communities. Muslims and Jews are also the most likely to volunteer for a political campaign. Again, 16% isn't a lot, right? It's still a small percentage, but far exceeds other faith communities and the general public at only 7%. So there is this sizable, highly invested, highly engaged group of American Muslims, and our community is more likely to have these folks than other faith communities, especially faith communities outside the Muslim and Jewish groups. Now, Muslims are on par with the general public in having given financial campaign contributions. They're on par with the general public and Christian and non-affiliated groups, but do lag behind Jewish groups Jewish Americans who are the most likely to have given to a political campaign. And what this means, I think, is that though Muslims are a small group, a small percentage of the total population, that they can have more of an impact by being more engaged beyond voting. Now, what are Muslim preferences when it comes to the next president? Well, first, Muslim approval of the president is among the lowest measured at 30% approve of the way that Donald Trump is handling his job as president. It's the lowest of any faith community, lower than the general public and lower than any other group except for non-affiliated Americans. However, that number has doubled since 2019, and so we were kind of looking at why that might be and what might be behind it. One thing we found is that it's not a uniform, it's not uniform across different racial groups within the Muslim community. White Muslims are the most likely to approve of President Trump's performance. So 50% of white Muslims approve of the president's performance, and that's on par with the 48% in the general public who also approve of the president. So white Muslims and whites in the general public are similar to each other in their likelihood to approve of the president's performance. Interestingly, non-white Muslims are similar to non-whites in the general public. So Black Muslims at 20% approval of the president, similar to the 16% in the general public, Black Americans overall. And then Asian and Arab Muslims are similar as well to Hispanic Americans overall. Now, approval of Trump climbs among Muslims of all backgrounds. And that's really the interesting part here, is that if you compare 2019 and 2020, the president's Muslims' approval of the president's performance does go up among every group, not just white Muslims, but it started out higher among white Muslims at 29% and then went all the way up to 50% in 2020, and also climbed among Black Muslims, Asian, and Arab Muslims, whereas in the general public, there was not this increase. It was actually the same from 2019 to 2020. And we're still trying to fully unpack what explains this rise in the president's approval. One theory is that this was taken during a national crisis. And during a national crisis, folks, a lot of times, especially vulnerable communities, will rally around the flag if they feel, a sense of insecurity. People do tend to support the leadership, however that leadership is, in whatever form that leadership takes, just because of a sense of national crisis and insecurity. And so that might be one explanation, although it is interesting that the general public didn't have that same effect on the general public, even though the timing was the same. Or in 2020, it was during right at the beginning of the pandemic. Muslim preferences, though, for Trump shouldn't be, exaggerated. So one thing we looked at is those who favored the president. Which candidate do they favor if the election were tomorrow? Which one would they choose? Which one would they want to win? And in 2016. 27% favored Bernie Sanders in the Muslim community, 40% favored Hillary Clinton, and 4% favored Donald Trump. Now, I do want to emphasize one thing here, because this might be a little bit misleading, is that this was during primary season that we took this read. And so the Republican Muslim vote was being spread out over lots of different candidates, not just Donald Trump. Now it's all been consolidated to just Donald Trump. He's of course the incumbent. So it's not so much that it increased by 10% as much as it sort of consolidated, because there are no other options. One thing to note, though, that I think is interesting is that this was taken right before Bernie Sanders dropped out of the race, and he does enjoy the highest support in the Muslim community of any faith community. So higher than the percentage of Jewish Americans who support Bernie Sanders, for example, even though of course he's Jewish. So it's just something interesting to note. The majority of Muslims, though, do plan on voting for a Democrat. So what these 14% of Muslims who support Trump or actually want him, to be our next president, a lot of times we get asked about Muslim Trump supporters. And so we wanted to kind of give a little bit more information about what's behind some of that. And what was interesting is that Muslim Trump supporters are very similar to Trump supporters in the general public. So for example, when it comes to political leanings, and these are the results, these are factors that came out of what is called a linear regression. What that means is that we did a statistical analysis where we hold all variables constant to see which variables will predict a certain outcome. In this case, that a Muslim or a person in the general public is a Trump supporter. So all else being equal, identifying as a Republican is a strong predictor of being a Trump supporter. That's not that surprising, and that applies to Muslims and the general public. Opposition to their opposition to your faith group, building a coalition with Black Lives Matter among Muslims and the general public is a predictor of being of Trump supporting the president. Support for the faith group, building coalitions with political conservatives on religious liberty issues, and saying that the economy is the most important priority facing the government. All of those are factors that predict support for Trump among Muslims and the general public. Being white, identifying as white, is a factor for both Muslims and the general public, as is a higher score on the Islamophobia index, meaning being more likely to endorse anti-Muslim tropes. And that applies to both Muslims and the general public. Now, what were things that didn't matter, that actually did not come out as important factors, that they made no difference? Muslims, as far as Muslims go, political ideology, whether someone considered themselves a conservative Republican or a moderate Republican, didn't matter. Political activity in the past year, support or opposition for faith community, building coalitions with pro-life groups. So the idea that people are voting for Trump because they're pro-life did not actually come out to be significant. And the other thing that also didn't make a difference is whether they supported or were opposed to their faith community building coalitions with LGBTQ groups. So both of those issues did not make a difference. And then demographics, some of the demographics that we might expect didn't make a difference. Income, education, whether they were born in the United States or immigrated here, age, gender, and then interestingly, religious practice. In both the general public and in the Muslim community, it was not about religious practice. So it was much more around partisanship than piety. So the idea that, Republicans or Trump supporters are more religious, it does not actually end up being true for whether you're talking about Muslims or the general public. Religious people are on both sides. And with that, I will end my screen share and introduce our panelists. Okay, so if we could have Ishraq and Tasneem please join us by video. Great. So we're very lucky and pleased to have Ishraq, Ali, and Tasneem Siddiqui joining us for this discussion. Ishraq is the field organizing director for MPower Change and has worked in faith-based and online organizing on both coasts of the United States. And we will be posting a link to his bio so that you can read more about him. Tasneem Siddiqui, Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui, is an ISPU expert and a visiting assistant professor in the Department of History, Politics, and Social Justice at Winston-Salem State University. And we're very happy to have both of you. So just to get started, Ishraq, let me start with you. As we mentioned in the presentation, the data shows significant gains in Muslim registration to vote. So over the past 5 years, from 60% to nearly 80% are now registered to vote. Does your work on the ground point to a cultural shift in the community over the past 5 years that is driving this increased turnout? Or how would you explain why we've seen this increase, which we haven't seen in any other community? And do you expect this trend to continue?
Sure. Thank you for the question, and assalamu alaikum. Thank you for having us on the panel and then also sharing the results. I think to answer that question, for sure, like this cultural shift for the Muslim community to be a bit more active, I think can be direct. I mean, personally, even for me, is related to the outcome of the 2016 election. Rather than us, our community being on the sideline and having our political destiny determined by other factors, why not play a more active role? And I'm saying this with confidence with the grassroots organizations and leaders that are reaching out to us. Literally, as an example, the debate happened a few days ago. Within the last 24 hours, we had several organizations and community members and volunteers reaching out to us saying that, how can we plug into your My Muslim Vote campaign efforts to make sure that folks are registered and mobilizing to vote? And then more so just kind of thinking about the trend, we've been running our My Muslim Vote campaign since 2017 on. Every year we've hosted a National Muslim Voter Registration Day. And every year we've seen that number grow from, just folks supporting the National Muslim Voter Registration Day campaign online to the number of partners that we have on the ground, indicating that several Islamic centers and several community leaders understand the importance of, having our communities at least flex their civic engagement muscle. Now, in terms of the question of like what can happen beyond the elections, our focus has always been that, we're going to continue to build grassroots power. And part of that is flexing our electoral muscle during election years. We are anticipating that, rather than focusing on a specific candidate, as long as our communities are animated and in touch with the issues that are impacting their communities, be it around healthcare, education, criminal justice reform, the Muslim ban, we are anticipating that folks will continue to stay engaged in that, in the civic engagement process. And to that end of it, our organization has really been prepping our leaders, our volunteers through our series of webinars and education and outreach, that the story doesn't stop on November 3rd, that we're going to continue to build power and engage and react and look at what the outcome of the election is and how that impacts the issues that we're going to continue to organize around.
Wonderful. Tasneem, let me bring you into this conversation. One of the most striking findings is the political differences among Muslims based on race. And Muslims who identify as white, for example, are as likely as whites in the general public to say they approve of President Trump's performance. As an expert on race and civic engagement, what does this say? What do you think this says about race and religion in the United States?
Sure. And again, assalamu alaikum to everyone, and thank you for having me. I'm actually not surprised by this statistic and this number. And I think one of the things that is really coming to fore with COVID-19, this global pandemic, and what these uprisings have been showing us very clearly and very acutely is the ways in which we think about race and racism and really white supremacy as something that is epiphenomenal, as opposed to something that is very much central to the story of the United States and central to the story of the social and economic order, which is a capitalist order, to the United States. And so we think so much about race as simply like an identity when we confuse that racial identity with thinking about race as something that is really about a structure of power and how it really structures power through difference and people's and using this identity of race, right? It's not just about skin color, but it's really about the ways and people are like, well, what do you mean? It's the ways in which think a modern racial capitalist racial order has been able to use the state and capital to capture, right? Particularly like white working class communities and tie it to their identity and tie this to their identity. And tie this to whiteness and masculinity and how they see themselves in the world, right? Despite your religious backgrounds. So one of the things that when we think about, how race is functioning and how it's so central to the structure and the institutions that then get created. One of the things that it's kind of been really, when I've been watching a lot of these debates and then the ways in which people talk about the ways that Trump and Biden have been talking about race in these debates, and particularly thinking about white supremacist groups that are being really like that Trump is shoring up to a particular extent, and thinking about white supremacy as something that is an extremist deviation, as opposed to understanding it. This is the structure, this is the logic of social organization that designs an American nation state. And so when you understand social movements have always been about recognizing and inserting their humanity and having a say about the politics and the decisions and economic structures that affect their lives, right? The challenge, I think, with religious communities is that we haven't, and this is across the board, and then particularly with American Muslim communities, we haven't mounted enough of a challenge in terms of transforming people to an understanding that this is, these systems of oppression that we are experiencing, because that's really what we're talking about. When we think about whiteness, that's an identity that is created out of violence and oppression. And we have to be clear about how that then manifests itself in the ways in which the types of decisions that people make. So for religious communities, what we're seeing is that we're not mounting enough of a radical transformation of self so that we can actually align ourselves with the communities that are experiencing these various forms of oppression and the ways in which they're being meted out structurally. And I don't want to take too much time, but when we think about race and religion, it's really about thinking about what are these institutions of power and how people have understanding their relationship to these institutions of power. And then they make political decisions based on maintaining or preserving those types of relationships. And so for us, I think a religious community that or the ways in which religious communities are mobilizing themselves. When you think about the Poor People's Campaign, how religion then can be used as an active spiritual imperative and political and social organization to actually compel ourselves to work for transformative change that people are asking us to do when we're seeing all of these uprisings.
Did it surprise you, Tasneem, to find out that religious practice, whether in the general public or in the Muslim community, had made no difference in whether or not someone voted for Trump? Even things like issues around social conservatism, being pro-life, actually made no difference?
No, not at all. Not at all. And I think one of the things, the reason why I think about that it didn't make a difference, and this is so important for us too, when we think about the types of ideologies in terms of, maintaining capitalism, maintaining sort of the structures of white supremacy, is these themselves function as they function as religions, so to speak. And I know that this might seem very, sorry, I put on my alarm so I make sure that I was only at under 5 minutes. And I think one of the things that we sort of have to unpack is the ways in which they actually function and structure the types of decisions that people make in their day-to-day existence. So that's why I pose this challenge to us and implicate us as religious communities, how we're thinking about, how forms of white supremacy, how forms of racial capitalism really function as religions that in a lot of different ways the ways in which we structure our religious communities end up reproducing those logics. So how we practice our religions don't really have an effect in terms of, really posing that challenge in terms of the types of decisions that we make in a political arena.
Thank you very much. Ishraq, building on some of this, this idea of how we make political decisions, our data still shows that a solid 15% of American Muslims over the past 5 years say they do not plan to vote, even though they're eligible. So in 2016, the reason given, some of the top reasons given were my vote will make no difference. No one represents my priorities. So how do you think Get Out the Vote campaigns can address this group and their concerns?
Yeah, I appreciate that question, because I think that's something that we encounter as we're doing our phone banking and our canvassing work. And it really comes down, as we get closer to the election, I would imagine that folks are going to be facing this voter fatigue aspect, getting so many calls and reminding folks to mobilize for one way or the other. But the key piece of this is that what happens in those off years, and how are we actually modeling our organizing in a way that's having people connect to their self-interest and are being able to articulate the issues that are actually animating them. So what we found, and this is kind of indicative within the broader organizing work, is that if we are able to engage with leaders or grassroots community members and get to understand what their self-interests or what the issues are that are motivating them beyond specific candidates, folks are more likely to vote around an issue that's impacting them. If it's around, loss of healthcare or the need for healthcare because of the pandemic, or, going through unemployment right now because of the pandemic, or, access to clean resources in terms of water in Michigan. So we're just trying to think of what we are trying to do as we're engaging and talking to different voters is really get folks to articulate what are the issues that are animating them. And if we're able to understand a bit of that we've seen as a way to kind of move the needle on how folks can actually see themselves making positive impact, particularly in local elections, then of course understanding that your vote is one piece of the puzzle of how you continue to stay engaged around an issue. And so for us, our ethos has always been with our My Muslim Vote campaign, yes, go out to vote on November 3rd, do what you can to mobilize your community, but the work does not stop there. Remember when you told me that the Muslim ban was impacting your family? This is the work that we're doing to continue that campaign to ensure that it's repealed, because it's not going to be resolved on November 3rd. It's not going to be magically our issues are going to be addressed by the power of one vote. It's the continued engagement. And we're realizing that, this is a long-term game that, we use the opportunity of the elections to mobilize folks to open up that conversation, but that we understand that we continue to build and, have folks be thoughtful around the issues that are motivating or that folks are being directly impacted by, and finding the channels to plug folks into campaigns and to work and to be part of a decision-making process to address that issue and work towards a resolution.
Yeah, it's really interesting you mentioned local elections and being locally involved, because one thing we found is one of the strongest predictors of voting, of being registered to vote, of participating is contacting a local elected official. And so when people are involved locally, they're much more likely to be involved overall. And I think it touches on this, or it's partially explained by the fact that if you don't think your vote matters because it's a national, it's a national election, you might believe that your vote really does count if it is a local election, where your vote absolutely does count and it is going to make a difference one way or the other. So I think building from the ground up that way really, I think is a very effective strategy. Tasneem, the data shows that, this is something I was asked about just a little while ago in an interview, that while Muslims' approval of the president is among the lowest of all groups measured, so we don't want to exaggerate it being, it's not like it's super high, it just has grown, it has doubled since last year. But interestingly, Muslims are more likely than the general public to be satisfied with the direction of the country. And that was right at the beginning of the pandemic. And this is it's not unusual. They're always slightly more likely than the general public to be satisfied with the direction of the country. But we also find that this satisfaction isn't uniform, right? It varies by race. So white Muslims are more satisfied than non-white Muslims, and by gender. Men are more satisfied than women. So my question to you, in light of all of that, how does your work on race in America and social justice inform these findings in light of growing social justice movements over the past few years?
Yeah, sure. So, and I think one of the things that, we also understand is, so the ways in which we think about race and gender, which are not actually, like I had said before, not incidental or accidental features, but really constitutive to the socio-political and economic order that structures the United States. And when we think about race and gender, it's really to think about the ways in which we get positioned and experience these different types of identities or significations through class, particularly. And the reason why I lay it out this way is because it's important for us to have that understanding and that analysis to make sense of, these statistics that sometimes we're kind of like, okay, they're contradictory to what we would think in terms of our common sense understanding. And I think, and what you've seen is, and a lot of my work is located within Black social movements. And so Black social movements have always been on really like the forefront of advocating and working for just human rights, right? So we see, and that's something that we're seeing right now in the most sort of acute iteration of that, because of what this global pandemic has actually revealed is these different types of contradictions in the society, right? To the point where we cannot, we cannot continue to lower that veil to say that it doesn't exist. We're a politics of life, and the protection and preservation of all forms of life and the human being are not at the center of that. And so the ways in which we think about how people are brought into this sort of racial order is how, there is really about the ways that we think about what it means to be human and humanity, right? And so when we break down a statistic like that, especially around race and gender, it has always been really historically women that have been on the forefront of these different types of social movements because of the ways in which they experience, right, the material conditions of these different types of signs and signifiers. I know that I always have to really break it down into an analysis because, what we're seeing, we might see a peak, but it's something that these social justice movements have always been organizing and have always been working towards a more equitable existence, in the nation state. So to answer your question, it's also not surprising to see that, with race and gender, you find you find the connections to the ways that, well, I lost the thought, I'm sorry. But the second part of your question, what was the second part of your question, if you don't mind?
The second part of the question is, how does this relate to social justice movements over the past few years?
Yeah. So I think that I've answered that question in sense of like how it's relating to social justice movements, right? So people are always actively on the forefront of trying to get the access to be able to make life, to have dignified housing, to have living wages, right? To fight against gentrification, to fight against the climate change, because they are experiencing the most ravages of environmental justice movements. So many times it has been Black and brown women that are on the forefront of those movements because of their precarity in experiencing these different types of, environmental racism, economic violence, policy violence, forced sterilization.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Tasneem. We're going to now switch to Q&A so we can bring in the audience to ask some other questions. So I'll be going through, you can type your question into the chat box and we will go through them, inshallah. So the first question is, does this mean that 63% are dissatisfied? The answer is yes. It's, you know, how satisfied, you know, the rest are not satisfied. So that, that is what that actually means. Is there a difference in age, gender, race, etc., among Muslims registered to vote and those that are not? Okay, so great question. There is no difference in gender on registration to vote. However, there is a difference for age. And just like the general public, younger Muslims are less likely than older Muslims to vote, just in general. Interestingly, there's no difference by nativity. So whether you're born in America or not does not actually impact how likely you are to be registered. And among race, the most likely group to be registered to vote are people who identify as Asian Muslims. And they're significantly more likely than Black, white, or Arab Muslims to be registered to vote. So that's how that breaks down. So that is that. Is there, okay, and then is Protestant, quote unquote, Protestant distinguished from white evangelical? In my experience, these are generally overlapping groups. Yes, okay, so great question. The white evangelical group is a subset of Protestants. So Protestants are anyone who identifies Protestant, and then we ask additional questions to identify white evangelicals from within the Protestant group. And we look at white evangelicals separately because they are a very distinct ideological, religious, and political force in our country. So we look at both Protestant as an umbrella group, and then within that, the white evangelical group. Okay. Okay, so results among Black and white Muslims align more with their ethnic group than their religious group. Yes, that is pretty much what we found when it comes to approval of the president, that race is a salient factor in how Muslims, as well as the general public, view President Trump. Okay, I want to bring in does anyone want to add anything to that last question? Okay. Do you think that the rising approval of Trump could be due to the Muslim ban being in the headlines more in the past years than this year? What do you guys think? How do you explain the rise in Muslim approval of President Trump's performance from 2019 to 2020 among all race groups? You're both muted, so please unmute to answer that question.
Maybe I can speak because we are working on this No Muslim Ban Ever campaign. I don't know, in terms of the rising approval of Trump amongst Muslims around the Muslim ban, we've found with our member base and then with our kind of surveying that we've done as well, repealing the Muslim ban is one of the top priorities for the communities that we're organizing and building with. So I think it may speak to the demographics that we're organizing and finding and seeing that, you know what, the community of Muslims that we're organizing and mobilizing and building power with are not in the political or the power center. And for them, repealing the ban is a priority. So I've seen that, and I can speak to that from our anecdotal experience.
Tasneem, what are your thoughts about this rise in approval? Do you think it's because the Muslim ban is no longer in the headlines?
I mean, I think part of it is that, and the unfortunate thing is that, we have a very short of attention span when it comes to really critical issues, because we're trying to address global social problems. And I think one of the other ways, and I was reading the chat too, because I wanted to see, I think Omar Esseldine said it, he's like, it's economy. And this is why it's very important for us to understand as American Muslim communities, the type of society that we actually live in, right? We live in a society that's organized around capitalism and what capitalism intends to do, and it has a racial character. And this is what you end up seeing in the ways in which people are responding to, and this is what COVID-19, has revealed to us. By the end of 2020, 30 to 40 million people are expected to be evicted by the end of 2020, right? And so it's like, what are then the priorities for a nation in terms of taking care of the mass of their population, but because they cannot afford it, or they're being forced to work during a global pandemic. So I say all that to say is that a lot of it is people privilege their financial interests, right, or economic interests over what is the most right, what is morally and ethically right to do in terms of, facing the fact that we're facing over 200,000 people have died in the last 6 to 7 months. Yeah. Right. So when we think about when we think about civic engagement, it's so much more than that. Right. Mm-hmm. It's like, how do we actually do what is the work that we need to do? Right? And how do we actually organize in our local communities so people can live, right? So they have access, and we have to think about it as well too, what the numbers reveal or don't reveal, right? Is what do we think is the responsibility of the government to do? Right? And how much of that has actually been privatized in order to make money, as opposed to actually benefiting the human lives of the people. And our political decisions, if we call ourselves religious communities, then need to be revolved around, how do we make sure that the least of these, right, have access to live a dignified human existence? And this is why I brought up, the Poor People's Campaign, using spirituality. And this is what, Black social movements have done historically. The power of Black social movements has actually been the imperative of spirituality. However that gets constituted, and it gets sometimes constituted with religion, in sort of formalized religions, but how spirituality actually is what is the impetus towards social movement and towards social justice. People get out in the streets, not because they're reckless, is because they deeply love each other. And it's a deep politics of humanity, right? So how do our political institutions actually reflect that? And at this moment in time, they don't reflect that. And they haven't, right? And so we see that. So a lot of our conversations then have to be, how do we do the work of creating the society where everyone's humanity is acknowledged and represented, and not in a hierarchicalized form, but in a form where it's like we have equity, right? We have justice. Sorry, I didn't, but it's a larger question.
Right. No, thank you for that. So the next question was, what anti-Muslim tropes are Muslim Trump supporters supporting? So we're going to actually be doing an entire segment on Islamophobia and the Islamophobia Index, but very quickly, we measure the level of endorsement of 5 anti-Muslim tropes, and they are that the level of agreement people have that Muslims are more violent than other people, discriminate against women, are partially to blame for acts of violence committed by other Muslims, so collective blame, are less civilized than other people, and are hostile to the United States. And so these 5 tropes were chosen because other research that we've built on show that endorsement of these 5 tropes predicts approval of anti-Muslim policies and even military attacks on Muslim countries. So that's where our Islamophobia Index came from. And Muslim Trump supporters are more likely to endorse these tropes as are Trump supporters in the general public. So Islamophobic perspectives are linked with wanting Trump to be the next president, whether you're a Muslim or not. So, Zarina, okay, so Dalia, can you explain more detail about how culture war issues, abortion, or queer rights do not impact Muslim support for Trump? Okay, so this was actually one of the biggest surprises for me, but that is what we found. So here's what I mean by that. We looked at all of these different variables, and two things that did not end up predicting Trump's support were how someone felt about building coalitions with pro-life groups, whether they supported it or opposed it, did not make a difference to their likelihood of supporting Trump, nor did their level of support or opposition to building coalitions with LGBTQ groups. So those two things were not factors. Now, what was a factor was building coalitions with religious liberty activists, so religious conservatives and religious liberty issues. If holding or supporting that was something that linked with Trump's support, and opposition to building coalitions with Black Lives Matter. So the two coalitions that mattered to being a Trump supporter was religious liberty and Black Lives Matter. One in support of, the second, of course, being in opposition of. But abortion and queer rights did not make a difference. And I'd love really other people's insights on why that might be, but it really showed me, to my surprise, that what is driving Trump's support is not religiosity, and it's not even social conservatism in the traditional way we think about it, but rather issues around the economy, around race, because their most important political issue was the economy. So that was a factor. So it was economic interest, it was racial issues, and then it was a perception of being, maybe victimized by non-discrimination laws, and so wanting to align themselves with religious conservatives working on religious liberty issues. Okay. We just have time for one more, and then we will. We plan on doing a Twitter town hall to answer the rest of the questions if we don't get to them. So there's several here. Okay, so were you able to get at the reason why the respondents indicated that they were more satisfied with the direction of the country? No, we don't ask a follow-up question, unfortunately. So we're not sure. I'll just answer one more that might be a little more substantial. It seems religious practice makes no difference for Muslims and the general public in supporting Trump. That is correct. Religiosity did not matter. So what motivates white evangelicals, 80% of them support Trump, to support him? It's a really good question. When you hold everything else constant, what really comes out is race. So being white does make you more likely to support Trump, and being a Republican and being conservative. So evangelicals are also Republicans and conservatives, and white evangelicals are also white. And so that does help explain it. There are also a lot of Black evangelicals, and they are not Trump supporters. So if religion was the only factor, you'd expect all these Black evangelicals to be Trump supporters, and they actually are not. And they're very devout. They go to church, according to our data, as often as do white evangelicals. So it's much more interestingly driven by race identity and partisanship than it is by religiosity. And so we'll leave it at that. And now we'd love for you to please answer our quick survey, and we'll see you next week at our next webinar about the rest of the report. And I'd really like to thank our panelists. We are so honored that you joined us today, and thank you so much for your thoughtful responses. Wow, we got 100% participation in our poll. So thank you very much. And see you next week. Assalamu alaikum.